Hey, welcome! Today we're diving deep into the world of paradoxes. But forget about simple brain teasers. We're talking about ideas that seem to fundamentally break our understanding of reality. Let's get into it. All right, so our investigation starts with something incredibly simple, a pile of sand. But hiding inside this pile is a question, a riddle really, that has been stumping some of the greatest minds for literally millennia.
Okay, think about this with me. One single grain of sand. That's not a heap, right? Of course not. Now, what if you add just one more grain? Still not a heap. And the logic here seems rock solid. If you have something that isn't a heap, adding just one tiny grain can't be the magic step that turns it into one. But if you follow that logic, one grain at a time, well, you can never ever actually make a heap.
And there it is! That's the paradox. You and I know that heaps of sand exists. Our intuition screams it. But our step-by-step logic, which seems perfectly sound, tells us they're impossible. It's this total head-on collision between what we perceive and what our logic tells us is true.
But hold on. What if we've been blaming the wrong culprit this whole time? What if logic itself isn't broken? Maybe, just maybe, the real flaw isn't something we've completely overlooked, a hidden assumption we made without even realizing it.
So you see, the issue might not be the process of our thinking, but the very foundation we're building on. It's about these invisible, unquestioned beliefs we accept as true before we even start to apply logic. And that is the radical idea we're going to explore right now.
This brings us to a brilliant mathematician and philosopher, Alexander Yesinin Vulpin. Back in 1965, he came along with a completely new way of looking at paradoxes. He basically said, hey, everybody, let's stop pointing the finger at logic. Instead, let's look at the general principles that we all just take for granted.
And this was his core insight. Yesinin Vulpin realized that paradoxes aren't failures of logic. They're actually clues. They are like these little windows that give us a peek into our most fundamental beliefs about what objects are, how we know things, and ultimately, what's even real. So it's time to go full-on detective mode. We're going to unmask these hidden culprits, these invisible assumptions that have been running the show from behind the scenes and tying our logic into knots. So here's our lineup, our three main suspects, straight from Yesinin Vulpin's work. Let's investigate them, one by one. All right, first up is the counting assumption. This is the deep-seated belief that the world can always be described in neat, clean, discrete steps. You know, just like counting. 1, then 2, then 3, and so on. We just assume reality works like that. And boom, we're right back at our heap of sand. We assume we can count our way from not a heap to a heap one grain at a time. But the real world is messy. Concepts like heap, or bald, or tall are fuzzy. They're continuous. They resist being shoved into that neat, step-by-step model. The paradox doesn't come from the sand. It comes from us trying to force a fuzzy concept into a rigid system. Okay, on to suspect number 2, the naming assumption. Now this one feels really intuitive. It's the idea that if we can create a name for something or a description, then that name must refer to a real, coherent thing that can actually exist. But what happens when we name a concept that refers to itself in a very weird way? Take this classic head-scratcher from set theory. We've just named a set with a very specific rule. Now, let's ask a simple question. Does this set contain itself? Well, if it does contain itself, then it violates its own rule, because the rule says it only contains sets that do not contain themselves. So, it can't be in. But wait, if it doesn't contain itself, then it perfectly fits the criteria, which means it should be in the set. We're trapped. It's a complete logical loop, all because we just assumed that our clever name had to point to a real, coherent thing. And that brings us to our final suspect, the identity assumption. This is the belief in perfect, absolute sameness. You know, if A equals B, then they are one and the same, totally interchangeable in any and all situations, no exceptions. But is identity ever really that clean-cut? So, this isn't just a fun list of tricky assumptions. What Yesinin Vulpin created here is actually a powerful new tool for understanding knowledge itself. You know, traditionally, people would sort paradoxes into different buckets, like logical paradoxes and semantic or language-based paradoxes.
But Yesinin Vulpin's approach is so much clearer because it shows that a lot of these seemingly different problems actually share the exact same underlying assumptions. They're not separate issues, they're all part of one big, interconnected web.
Now this is absolutely crucial to get. These assumptions aren't about the rules of logic, like if A, then B. They go much deeper. They're about epistemology, which is just a fancy word for our theories on how we know what we know. And they're about ontology, our fundamental beliefs about what actually exists.
And this leads us to a really key philosophical idea, sometimes put as ontology is gnoseological. I know, they're big words, but the concept is actually pretty straightforward. It just means that what we believe is real is profoundly shaped by the tools we use to know it. So if your main tool is step-by-step counting, you're naturally going to struggle with the reality of fuzzy, continuous things like heaps.
So after pulling back the curtain and unmasking all these hidden assumptions, what have we really learned about what paradoxes are?
Well, the big takeaway is this. Paradoxes are not a sign that the universe's logic is broken. They are a feature of our own thinking. They're like mirrors that reflect the invisible architecture, the unquestioned rules that we use to build our sense of the world. And recognizing these assumptions isn't just about solving brain teasers. It helps us understand why we might dismiss ideas that don't fit into our neat pre-built categories, in philosophy and in everyday life. So I'll leave you with this to think about. What invisible assumption are you using at this very moment? What unquestioned belief is shaping your reality right now? That's definitely something we're thinking about. Thanks for joining me on this journey.